Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Neutrality Studies. My name is Pascal Lotta. I'm an associate professor at Kyoto University, and today I'm joined again by my compatriot and friend, Colonel Jacques Baud, former colonel of the Swiss Army, intelligence officer, and since December 2025, also a person non grata, or a person on the EU sanctions list. And we've talked to Jacques before. He's given us quite a bit of explanation on this channel. He's on the channel of Nima, Dialogue Works, and his case, I think your case, Jacques, is now well known, and I'm happy to report that also in Switzerland, where I'm visiting right now, your case is being discussed in the circles that I've been with, on the left, on the right, and your case is having quite an impact on the discussion about the future of Switzerland, the future of Europe in general, and I'm very glad to have you back here on the channel.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me again. Thank you for all the support and all you have done in favor of my case. I know all the efforts you have made in the last 2 months about this, and I'm really grateful about everything you have done and all you have also triggered and then helped to improve my situation. But as you rightly said, my situation is my situation, of course, but it entails a danger for others as well. I mean, my case is a precedent, or is a possible precedent for other cases in the future. And I think a lot of people have understood that we are in the case of an extrajudicial type of punishment. And this is something that goes against any rule, practices, and even values that we have in Europe. I mean, the history of democracy in Europe is based on those principles of habeas corpus, the Rechtsstaat, the rule of law. And when we say rule of law, that means that everything is ruled by law. And here, in my case, we have exactly the opposite, that you have people who rule outside of the law. And that contains a very, very, very significant danger, because, and especially because the Europeans, let's put it that way, have not realized that aspect, because so far the measures I am under are foreign policy measures. So they were designed to reach people outside of the limits of the European law, if you want. So if I can put it that way. So it's for people living outside of the EU. And therefore, this is exactly the same thing. I mean, you can compare, in war, you have the right to kill people. But when you are not at war, you are not allowed to kill somebody. So that's why there is a differentiation between foreign policy, in which I include war, or at least not internal wars, but external wars, and domestic policy. And in domestic law, it's forbidden to kill, but in foreign policy, you may have this right under certain circumstances, of course. So that's exactly the same thing here. And when we start to confuse law and not no law, then we start to be in a situation that is extremely concerning. That's exactly. I mean, you have made a video about the issue of legality, not illegality, illegality, extra legality, and out of law. And we are exactly in this case. So it's extremely concerning. And as I see that more and more people start to understand that, which at the beginning was not the case. When the sanctions were issued, nobody understood. Some people thought it was a sanction, a normal judiciary decision, but it's not a judiciary decision. It's an extrajudicial decision, and that's the problem. So that's that. This is our, I think, just a few thoughts about what you just said, and I think this that should guide, in fact, the whole issue. I mean, obviously, I'm in the center of the problem today, but what happens to me today can happen to anybody tomorrow, and that's something that nobody wants.
No, that's definitely not what we can want. And this regime is, if it doesn't stop, it will be expanded. I mean, it is a tool, and at the moment, it's a tool that's being used experimentally, I would say, to see what's possible. And you can also see how there was a progress, right, of using sanctions against states only first, and then against entities, then against people who were close to the entities, then against especially in Russia, right, but then against people inside Russia. Who were connected somehow, journalists who reported from Donbass and so on, and then against individuals inside the European Union. You are not an EU citizen as a Swiss, but Hussein Dogru is, and he's in Germany, and you can see how there's this experimental phase, and if it doesn't stop here, it will get worse. Now, are there any updates on the legal front, like with your lawyers or with the people that you talked on? How you are approaching the legal battle against this? Anything that you can share with us, because obviously maybe not everything can be made public.
Yes, so there are obviously some things that I'm not allowed to say publicly at this stage. We have received, my lawyers and me, of course, have received the documents that were the base of the decision to put me on sanctions. So we know what is the substance of the accusation, if you want. Unfortunately, we are not able to share that. And even if we were allowed, I would not do that, because that will be part of that will define the strategy we will have to go against the sanction decision. It's important to realize also, some people say, well, in Belgium, for instance, there's a professor of international law that is, well, we are in a rule of law, because now it can go against the decision. Well, this is not the rule of law. This is just, we are just attacking, if you want. If I can summarize a little bit, the strategy is that we cannot go against the decision itself. We can only attack the Council of the European Union and say, well, they took they took a decision they should have taken. That's it. So this is it's not a defense in the legal sense of the word. It's a counterattack, if I can put it that way. And that means that we will base our strategy on the substance of the accusation, selbstverständlich. That's German, sorry, obviously. But what I can say is that in all the documents I received, none of them cite a direct quote I shouldn't have made. None of them put a direct quote, and it's always hearsay, what people have told about me, or things like that. There is no direct quote of me.
Hey, very brief intermission, because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing, not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascallotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. I was told by Hussein Dogru that actually the accusations are the council refuses to. The council doesn't have the power to do criminal investigation, so they can only use publicly available sources to create the case against you. so they base all of their stuff on what has been published before, and they use secondary sources, as in magazine X said the following about Jacques, therefore the accusation stands, right? Is that the case? Is that the thing?
Yeah, it's absolutely that. It's absolutely that. And that's even more shocking, because I don't want to discuss the case of others, because obviously each case has its specificities. But in my case, everything I have said is in my books.
Mhm.
There is no, it's written somewhere, so you can check if an accusation, or somebody said I said this or that. You can verify. Everything is verifiable, but it's absolutely no verification done by the EU. So they select specific information just in order to substantiate the accusation, but they don't check all the information. So it's cherry picking, and it's in technical word. Cherry picking is a nice word, but technically speaking, this is like you built up a conspiracy theory. What the EU does is they build up a conspiracy theory. That means they never go to the original source. They never go to the original document. They just take what people have understood or said about it, and that's it. They make their case with that. And that's extremely interesting. I think when the whole thing will be done, I mean, I will certainly, I mean, when all that can be made public, I can tell you that will be extremely devastating to the European Union, because if they had taken one of my book and said, well, in your book you say this and that, you can say, okay, I have said that, it's written, no problem, I can justify, but it's not even that. As I said, there is not a single direct quote of me, and they even take an article in the press where I said that I was going against Russian propaganda. So I was not even endorsing. I was saying, I just set facts, saying that Russia was saying the things in my opinion, Russia should not have said. So sometimes you don't understand. They probably just picked article just where they saw the name Jacques Baud. They just picked it, and that's it.
That's but what's the challenge for us now is to figure out how the process in the background works, because that might give us clues about how to most effectively then challenge this the buildup of this sanctions, internal sanctions regime, right? And one of the things we seem to now understand is that the Council of the EU, it's not, I must repeat, it's not the Commission, it's the Council. The Council, I mean, according to my information, they now have they have a legal department, and you guys are now in touch with the legal department, right? And they are now basically, is that the case, the legal department of the Council?
Well, this is, I'm not exactly aware about who exactly my lawyers will address. I don't know if it's the legal department of the European Council, or if it is the European Court of Justice. There might be a slight difference there. Again, but I don't want to discuss those details. They might be very interesting, but I'm not able at this stage to give more details about this, because right now we are working with the lawyers to. We are. I'm sorry. I'm mixing. I have spoken so much Germans in the recent days that I'm confusing German and English. I'm sorry about that. But the thing is that we are now elaborating a strategy, and we are analyzing the documents that were provided to us, which are called working papers. That's the technical word expression for those documents. So we are working on these, checking exactly all sentence by sentence, everything.
May I
Yeah.
May I just jump in? Sorry, the only thing I want to say is that the way it works, I think, will be important because there is a counterparty, right? And the counterparty, the people who execute this, are probably the legal department of the council, if I understood it correctly. And they build the case against you, and then the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, is in the middle, right? It's the one that then has to analyze, and maybe they will forward everything, but those are the
Yes.
parties. Interesting thing to me is like what can the council's legal department do, and what can they not? So they cannot do a criminal investigation because it's not a criminal process. Hence, they have to build their case based upon a specific process internally, and that process seems to be, well, extremely flimsy because it's an experimental phase for them.
Well, the thing is, again, I don't know exactly who built the case because there is not a single legal comment on that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can say that they provided me with articles taken from internet, basically, without a single comment, period. So there is no legal comment. I mean, they could have said, well, through that, we decide or we assess that this is propaganda, whatever. There's no comment at all. They just sent articles, period. Some have been translated mechanically, and I don't know what kind of software they have because it's extremely poor, to be frank with you. It's just amazing. And sometimes even the translation is not exactly contradictory, but doesn't reflect what I said in the original language, as an example. So there is no legal consideration, absolutely none. This could have been the work of any individual working. I mean, he just types Jacques Baud and just collect what comes up. That's all, period. So that's where we are at this stage. My understanding is that my lawyers will address the European Court of Justice. What happens after that is something I don't know, but that will probably be the comment or I mean, I don't know exactly how this document will be called, but let's call it protest. Let's put it that way. It will address to the European Court of Justice or the arguments against or to lift the sanction or things like that. Now, just to update you on my situation, that the lawyers have also asked to have a humanitarian derogation. For me, that means that, as I have already said, I normally have no access to my bank account in the EU, meaning that since December, I'm not able to buy things. I'm not able to buy gas for my car. I'm not able to buy food. I'm not able to spend money that you normally do through your bank account with a bank card or things like that. So through the humanitarian derogation, I should be able to spend money for my essential needs. That means to feed, to pay my electricity bills and things like that. On the 6th of February, the Belgium Ministry of Justice has granted this humanitarian derogation. That means that's 10 days ago, but nothing had happened yet. So I'm at the same point as we had in December, basically. There is an official decision, but this has not been implemented so far. As of today, it is not the case. And say the way the administration work in I mean, I don't want to criticize too much Belgium, because Belgian people are nice people, but nevertheless the administration works as it works, and that means that it's extremely slow and not very effective. And that's exactly where we are. And when this will be implemented, that means I will not have a full access to my bank account. I don't know exactly what the rule will be, to be honest, because as I said, it's limited to my essential needs and for a limited amount of time. So I will have to renew the request and all that. So this is sorry.
It's part of what makes this so horrible, right? The punishment, the effect of the punishment comes immediately, without even telling you. And the remedies against it, and even the humanitarian relief, comes over time, like slowly, slowly. Yeah.
Exactly. This is exactly that. I mean, this is something we have already discussed in previous interviews, if I remember, that they are not limited in time. You know, when you are normally, you go on trial for something because you have stolen whatever a car, right? Then you go a sentence, and you have you have to go to jail, but for a certain amount of time. It's not unlimited. You have 1 month, 2 months, 1 year, I don't know, but this is the judge make a decision, and you go for 1 week, 2 weeks, but this is your jail time period. And once it's done, it's done. Here, it's not the case. This is essentially unlimited. Obviously, the sanction list is regularly reviewed, and my sanction list will be reviewed in October, as far as I know. May be wrong, but I think it will be reviewed in October, and without any other comment, it will be extended. So this is a situation where you are punished, but for unlimited amount of time. But again, this is very important for people to understand, that we are outside of the law. And being outside of the law, that means the decision is not limited by the law. And if I put it in an extreme way, and again, I'm not saying that it will go up to that point, but the principle remains the same. The death penalty is forbidden, doesn't exist in Europe, because the law in Europe, in EU, and in individual states say that there is no death penalty. But when you are out of the law, when your decision is above the law, that means that theoretically you could decide this. And essentially, this extrajudicial punishment or sanction is exactly what the Americans do when they decide to eliminate someone somewhere. It's an extrajudicial process. This is exactly the same idea to have people in Guantanamo, so that they escape the law system of the United States, because they are on a territory which is not under US law. So it's extrajudicial. So, and the reason they did that way is that because you cannot use torture according to law in the US, you cannot use torture to have information. But when you are no longer under US law, you are on an extrajudicial territory, then you can use torture. And that's exactly the purpose of Guantanamo. And that's exactly what we have. That it's very concerning, because that means that you can apply measures that are normally designed to address issue outside of the European law, but now you can apply exactly the same measures to people living inside the European Union.
Can we talk about this? Because I think this is then where the bigger picture also like straight connects to what's happening to you. And Natalie Yamb also pointed this out. She told me, look, in Africa, we've been used to being targeted by European and US sanctions. They've been using this tool against us forever, also against just simple activists, right, who are anti-colonial activists. And what you just described is exactly the thing. The drone strikes, the Mr. Obama signing off on the killing of individuals in Afghanistan with drones, even American citizens, signing off on the killing of them is not a judicial process, right? Using sanctions and in this power of foreign policy, including military deployments, part of foreign policy, is a way to fight against enemies. And this fight against enemies and this turning inward of the weapons that have been used to fight on the outside, this is extremely problematic, but it's exactly what this kind of mindset does. And I mean the colonial mindset, that there are interests and there are people who are running against these interests, and whether they're on the outside, the enemy on the outside, or the enemy on the inside, we will target them. And the legal process that we build usually in order to protect us from the state, from the Leviathan, don't apply anymore because you're not inside the system. You're taken outside, and then you're being targeted by the executive.
Well, again, I don't want to go into the whole issue of colonial, anti-colonial thing like that. This is probably going a little bit, let's say, probably not too far, but far from my point of view. But the thing is that sanctions, we have to understand that sanctions, generally speaking, are a way to interfere with domestic policy of countries, essentially. Other states, yeah. I would say of countries, because you can have in the UN system, the UN Charter allows to take sanctions against a state under certain conditions. But the UN Charter is also at the same time the legal system or the legal framework that defines that you shouldn't interfere with domestic law. That means that it has the tool essentially to say, no, you cannot interfere, but in certain conditions, we can break that rule. And that's
but only under the UN system, only within the Security Council system, right?
Because they define that you should not interfere, but they can define also exception to their own rule. And basically, when the EU or Switzerland or the United States or whoever decides by itself to apply sanctions, then it goes beyond what the UN does, because that should be normally done by the UN. This issue of interfering or not should remain at UN Charter level and at UN level. And Article 7 and things like this, like embargoes and all that, there are measures that are defined in the UN Charter, and that there are tools to influence a situation where you have obviously a massive human rights infringements and things like that. But the problem is that the US first, but also then the EU and individual countries, because we can even say that when we talk about Russia, usually people say that Switzerland has adopted the sanction of the EU, and that's partly true. But Switzerland has also its own sanctions. In fact, Switzerland has applied more sanction to Russia than the EU.
Yep.
You see, so that means that we are going beyond what the UN does, and we go beyond even what the EU does. But EU should not. My view is that that's the view of many international observers and lawyers and all that the only legal sanctions are those decided by the UN.
Yeah, and we must be very clear, the United Nations themselves, they condemn unilateral coercive measures, so
Exactly.
sanctions, by states that don't do it under the control of the Security Council. And so that's the difference to the sanctions against Iran. They were done under the UN roof at the time when Russia and China were still willing to play along, and before everything changed. And also the sanctions. There was this study published in December, just around the time when they put sanctions on you, in the Lancet, this public health, health magazine, right? And they analyzed between 1979 and 2021 the health impact of US and European unilateral sanctions. And they came to the conclusion that these two things together kill every year 500,000 people.
Yeah,
500,000 people every year.
Yeah, this is something I've pointed out in my book, Governing by Fake News. In fact, I mentioned this case of sanctions. And when we talk about all these extrajudicial measures, and you mentioned Obama and all that, under Obama, it was a study that was made about the effect of those extrajudicial killings, as an example. And they noticed that only 4% of those people killed eventually were really terrorists. 4%. That means that 96% of those people killed were in fact bystanders, collateral damage, you name it. And again, nobody is accountable for that because it's extrajudicial. The problem here is, in fact, I mentioned before what is, in very rough terms, I explained what is in the working papers. And you see that the basis for making extrajudicial killing is equally weak. We don't know exactly who we are killing. We don't know exactly who we are sanctioning. We don't know exactly why, what for, and other. Because when you are in a judiciary system, when you are in the process, a trial, you check the accusation. You have a way to verify whether or not the accusation is correct or not. That's why you have lawyers. That's why you have a general attorney and all that. And they present their case. This is discussed. And at the end, you have the bottom line of this, whether there's a sanction or no. But in essence, you have a tool that allows to check the accusation. Here in extrajudicial systems, and that applies to sanctions, I'm not talking about unilateral sanctions, then that means you have absolutely no tool to verify whether your decision is based on something solid or not. And that's the whole thing. The UN sanctions, when they were, you mentioned the case of Iran, and when the Security Council decides on sanction, that means that the whole issue has been discussed in the Security Council, and there is an exchange, and some people will say that it's right, some other no, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, you come up with a decision that has been weighted by both parties. In the unilateral sanction system, nobody verify what you say. It's just merely accusations. And it might be you decide that somebody is a terrorist. What is exactly a terrorist? We can, again, I don't want to go into the case of other individuals you have mentioned, but what is a terrorist? Hamas is considered as terrorist by 30 countries or 31 countries or so in the world, but not by 160 countries. So who defines exactly what a terrorist is and things like this? So and when you start to apply unilateral sanction on somebody because of this criteria, is the criteria universally accepted? And since there is no trial, since there's no process to decide whether your accusation is correct or not, well, you are exactly in the arbitrary decision. And that's exactly where we are.
But it's even one level worse, because in a judicial system, any accusation has to be an accusation of you breaching a rule, and these rules, we call them laws, right? It's even worse because there are no rules, right? Again, propaganda in Europe, in Switzerland, in the EU is not illegal. There's no law that says this will count as propaganda and this is illegal, because in order to do that, you need to bring it to Parliament first. You need to decide and then say, okay, this text, we're going to publish it, and anyone who breaches this is doing something illegal. We don't have that. So, and in the EU, in the case of the of the United Nations, the whole idea is that the powers check each other, right? You make an accusation, you say like, this is bad for the UN system, and then you check, and if all five great powers actually say like, you know what, that's true, this is bad, then you use a political process, the sanctions, in order to go against what you decided is bad. And in the EU case, what we have is the member states saying like, this is bad for us, and we are going to impose this, but again, without giving the person on the receiving end the chance to actually use the entire system of the law in order to have a fair trial, because it's not a trial.
No, it's not exactly. No, you're absolutely right. This is something that brings us back to the 15th century or something like that, or in the Soviet Union, or under the worst dictatorships. And I say even the worst dictatorship, because you may have some authoritarian government, but it may still be a rule of law. The law might be tough, the laws may be difficult and probably unjust, but they are laws. While here in the EU, there is simply no laws. So we are outside of the law. There are laws in the EU, so obviously, but this kind of decision of sanction is out of any law. And again, what is propaganda? And then people will say, well, it's hybrid warfare. What is exactly hybrid warfare? Nobody knows exactly what it is. And in fact, what people say most of the time, well, that's a Russian doctrine. It comes of the so-called Gerasimov doctrine. What is the Gerasimov doctrine? Does it exist? Well, it doesn't. I mean, this whole issue of hybrid warfare was started off in fact, it started off in 2013, as Gerasimov wrote an article that was, in fact, an analytical article about warfare. And this was taken by a British expert, Mark Galeotti, who interpreted that article as an hybrid warfare doctrine for Russia. And he called it the Gerasimov doctrine. And that is what most people refer to when they talk about hybrid warfare. The problem is that Mark Galeotti looked a little bit deeper into his own assessment and came back in 2018, I think, probably, or 2017 maybe. I don't remember exactly the date. But in any case, he wrote an article, I think in Foreign Policy, where he said, I'm sorry for creating the Gerasimov doctrine. It doesn't exist. And he wrote several articles recently to say that, in fact, he made a mistake. He misinterpreted what Gerasimov said. The problem is that nobody mentioned these articles now. Everybody has gone wild about this idea of hybrid warfare, and the Russians have this doctrine, things like this, meaning that the very idea of hybrid warfare now has taken its own dynamics, and everybody is inventing new stuff and all that. Fact of the matter is that and I wrote an article about the Russian art of war recently, that was last year, and I obviously talked about this issue, and there is no hybrid warfare aspect or doctrine in the Russian military doctrine. There is clandestine warfare. There are a lot of things. I have written, by the way, a book about Russian clandestine warfare, which incidentally, that's something that was published in the early 2000s, and incidentally, it was translated in Russian in Ukraine, by the way. Just for
yeah, just it's so yeah. The situation is the situation would be really funny if it wasn't so utterly tragic and devastating. But yes, please.
Yeah, this is that. So, and I know Russian obviously does a clandestine warfare. The problem is that we have so drifted towards our own understanding what is hybrid warfare that we have a completely false view on the actual clandestine warfare that Russia is doing. Russia is not doing at all what we say they are doing. They are doing something other. I mean, they are probably more effective because, in fact, all these people who point out at hybrid warfare, they are distracting us from the real clandestine warfare which is waged by Russia. And that's probably the reason why Russia is happy about this. So we are talking about something that is it's more subtle than one we think. And again, I remember that that was in my book, by the way, about the art of war. I mentioned a program by TV5 Mode, which is a French-speaking program of the various French-speaking countries, Canada, Switzerland, Belgium, France, and so on. And they made a special program about hybrid warfare. And there was an expert from a French institute there. She mentioned 5 examples of hybrid warfare, Russian hybrid warfare, including the cutting undersea cables and things like this. She gave 5 examples. All the 5 examples, had been previously debunked by other media, because we knew that when the undersea cable that were broken, that was the fish nets and things like this. So everybody had already an explanation. And the same with the drones, for instance. We have mentioned last year in October, November, this kind of a drone frenzy. We saw drones everywhere. And almost all these cases have been explained. And there's a website, a Dutch website that it's called Drone Watch. When I'm not doing war, they checked all that, and they say, well, we cannot. These are Russians, because they have analyzed all these cases. So, meaning that we are really making up something that serves the narrative against Russia, but the consequence of that is that it may not be the way Russia wages its war, meaning that we are simply distracting ourselves from the real war. And this is, so it looks good from the outside, because it's, so we are not naive, we fight the Russians and we are strong and all that. But in reality, we are fighting nothing, and we are just fighting ourselves, but we are not improving our ability to fight the Russians. If there is a war if there were at one point, if there will be, I don't know if it would be a war in Europe against Russia, but then we would be weak, not because we don't have weapons and all that, but because we are not able to understand how the Russians think their war, how they think the way to wage war. So, sorry.
No, but this is brilliant, and this is exactly why this is such an incredibly dumb process. Because what you're explaining here is that on the one hand, you have the Russians with their doctrines, with their way of approaching things, and we've got other people, Andrei Martynov, Scott Ritter, who also point out, look, they work like this, and they have like very, very elaborate doctrines and systems within which this is the Russians. And then you have the European Russians, the Europeans who portray the Russians as doing this one, which is completely different from how they actually are. And then we focus all of the attention on how to fight that imaginary Russian, not real Russian. And anyone who tells us that, this is wrong, by the way, we put them under sanctions. You are one of the people who can help to actually rectify the analysis and tell them, look, the real threat of the Russians is actually ABC. But those parts are now being taken out because they don't, they do not coincide anymore with the European way of wanting to see the Russians, which then means that we're setting ourselves up, even if it comes to a war, to utter failure. It is such a process of stupidity, of actually of narrowing everything down to an ideal instead of narrowing it, of figuring out what things actually are.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. This is exactly the problem. And that's exactly, by the way, what's happening in Ukraine. I have described already in 2022 all the why Ukraine is weak or weaker than Russia. The weaknesses, better said. And I didn't say why it was weaker. I just explained the weaknesses of Ukraine. Because the at war, you don't need. Obviously, it's better when you have more tanks than the other. It's better when you have more aircraft than the other, and all that. But doesn't mean that you can, in fact, win a war with less equipment than the other, provided you understand how your enemy functions and you can understand how to bypass its own strategy and things like this. But for that, you have to understand perfectly what they are doing. And in what we have done with Ukraine, because we tried to impose Ukraine a certain understanding of the war, which is not related to the reality. And many times the Ukrainians have complained, and I mentioned that in my books. They've complained many times that they are not prepared for the right war. That the soldiers that were trained in France, Germany, UK were not prepared for the kind of war which is fought in Ukraine. Because they were trained by probably very nice officers and trainers and all that, but people who had a completely different battle experience. As a result, those Ukrainians came back to Ukraine and said, well, we were not trained for the right battle, for the right fighting. All the think that when we provided weapons and all that, we never thought about the problem it poses to Ukraine. And we have, in fact, increased. We have provided a lot of weapons, a lot of money, a lot of training. All that is correct, but with no also understanding of how everything we provided could be more effective. And in fact, we provide a lot of things, but they are not effective as they could be, as they should be, because we failed to understand how all that works together. The essence of warfare is not the kind of weapon you have, is how you use those weapons together. I always take the example that the tank was invented in World War One. The aircraft was invented in World War One. Machine gun and all that were invented in World War One. But in World War One was no, let's say, major impact on the battlefield. It influenced the battlefield, but not in a major way. What happened during World War II? The Germans realized that you can use and combine those different tools, those different weapons into one system. This is exactly what you call the Blitzkrieg. And that's exactly why the Germans were effective, especially in the first part of the World War II, because they managed to put everything together, to combine them into one system, not in different. You didn't use tanks here and aircraft there and things like. No, everything was combined into one system under the same command and control system, and that gave the efficiency of the whole thing. That's why the Germans could defeat the French, even if they had less tanks than the French. They are even worse tanks than the French. The French had much better tanks than the Germans, but those tanks were used as they were used during World War One. But Germans managed to put that together and combine artillery, tank, infantry, aircraft, and all that into one thing. And that's exactly what we are witnessing in Ukraine. The Russians have been extremely, they've learned from the lessons of World War II, especially, and they managed to make of their armed forces one system. And that system works as a body. I mean, your left hand or your right hand, all that works in a coordinated way. Even if you have my right hand is not my left hand, but they can work together into one system. And that's exactly how the Russians have made their army, because we supported the Ukrainian once with a couple of tanks here, once a couple of machine guns there, one a couple of missile here and there, and all that. The Ukraine have never managed to bring all this support into one system. And you may probably remember that when the French proposed to the Ukrainians to provide Mirage 2000s, which is one of the best aircraft that the French have. I mean, they obviously have the Rafale, but Mirage 2000 is an excellent aircraft as well. But what happened? What did the Ukrainian, the spokesman of the Ukrainian Air Force? He said, "We don't want those aircraft. They will complicate us our life." You see, so we always see the war like kind of a linear thing. I have a gun bigger than yours, so I'm winning. It's not like this. It's not working, and that's exactly what I explained. By the way, it's also very interesting. When I wrote my book about the art of war, I explained all these differences, the weakness and strengths from both sides. Nobody took my book and said, "Oh, let's try to study what are the weaknesses of Ukraine and try to correct that." Nobody has done that. Nobody had even tried to correct the mistake we have done. Nobody tries to make our support to Ukraine more effective. Nobody has done that.
It's kind of insane, you know. Anyone will understand that if you build an office or if you build an organization and then you tell them you have to have computers and then you just tell them, "Oh, I'll support you. Here, have a Mac and have a Windows and have Linux and use this USB stick, use that," then you will create a chaos. You will create complete chaos. Anyone understands that. But when it comes to military realm, everybody thinks, "Oh, a new fighter jet." Well, they're fighter jets, right? And you know what you're describing to me just a moment ago, this problem with like how we imagine the enemy to be, it reminds me so much of an 800-year-old European novel, Don Quixote.
Exactly.
If you want to fight a giant, and then you get the gear and everything, and you charge against it, but it turns out that it's a windmill, you're gonna hurt yourself.
Exactly.
We're in that process. We're in an 800-year-old problem.
This is exactly. I mean, the example you have just mentioned is exactly the point. Is exactly to the point. When we talk about Russia, we are fighting windmills. Is exactly what we are doing, because we have defined. I'm not saying. I mean, I don't know if we will have once a war against Russia, and maybe it may be or not, but regardless of whether it might or not be, if we consider that Russia might be the enemy, then we have to assess it properly. You see, you cannot just imagine that it could be like this or like that. It is like this or it is not, period. So this is exactly what you said. I mean, it's very strange, but we are in those times. We are in very irrational times, in fact, and nobody understands. And that's probably also the reason why we need today more censorship, more narrative control, and all that, because probably intuitively, probably not explicitly, but implicitly, people realize that our leadership is failing, is not making the right decisions. And as I always said, during the Cold War, and I'm a Cold Warrior, during the Cold War, we didn't prohibit Pravda, Literaturная Gazeta, Komsomolskaya Pravda, and all that. That you could buy them very freely in our news outlets in Europe, in Bern, in Geneva, in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
They were not banned. Today we need to ban Russian media. And the communists, I always take also the example of the French Communist Party, which was had extremely strong ties with the Soviet Union Communist Party, as an example. It was not banned in France. It was not banned because we were confident that our decision-making process, that our system was superior. Therefore, we didn't need censorship. Sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. The thing is that the difference to Don Quixote now is that Don Quixote was one man with a delusion. And now you have in Europe 400 or so million people that need to share the same delusion, because if they don't, then they will start arguing about the windmill and start finding other ways around. So you need to create a common mass delusion. And that's a shitty process, but it's the process we're in.
Yeah. This looks, I mean, we started this discussion about my sanctions. And obviously, there's an Erscheinung, the appearance of the problem, or what with. But there is something much deeper, I think, that we need to be concerned about, and that affects all countries, EU and non-EU, that concerns also Switzerland, is the quality of the leadership in general, the way we take decisions. All that is, to me, a very source of concern. We have more and more people who take. Our leaders are hip shooters. You see, we are no longer people who have thorough thinking, analysis before taking decisions. They just decide out of the blue. They have to react. It's a Twitter type of decision. What you received information, what's your reaction? And within minutes, without having heavy thinking, analysis, and all that, you have to react. And that's why you have people, notoriously Emmanuel Macron, who said one thing on one day and something totally different the next day, and all that, because we are always in this kind of dynamics that the reaction time is more important than the content of what you say.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And Jacques, look, this is always very, very valuable, your analysis and your explanations. I am very sorry that you're now in the place that Hannah Arendt once called, this horrible moment when the political starts crashing into the personal. For us, who are not sanctioned, these are two levels. For you, it's now one. But thank you for talking about this and for continuing also the intellectual engagement with what this moment means. Is there anything that you would like to add, or any place where you would like people to go to read about this?
Well, we all know, some friends of mine in Switzerland are building up or establishing a support committee where people will go. I'll give you the contact. It's now being built up. I'll give you that's one part of it. Absolutely.
We are, nous sommes Jacques Baud. We are Jacques Baud.
Exactly. And there are some actions that have been, and I will keep you posted on this. But beyond this, I would like to thank all of you, including yourself, by the way, because with your website, your program, nothing you had done, you were instrumental in supporting me. But there are many others also who appear also on your show, by the way, from time to time, who have supported me. But beyond, all these are prominent figures, but there are a lot of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who have expressed their support to me, who feed me, some of them. But I can tell you that I can hardly get out of my home or my house here without having been greeted on the sidewalk by someone who supports me. In the recent time, I've never been outside of my home without being greeted by someone who wants to express his support. And that's absolutely fascinating, because before my sanctions, that was not the case. Obviously I was known, but probably not in the same way. And today I receive support from everywhere, literally. So a lot of people write letters to my publisher, to me, emails, SMS, you name it. I just had last week 2 Swiss guys who I didn't know before. They called me and say, well, we want to show our support, and they came here they just departed at 4 a.m. from Switzerland. They came here and then went back the same day to Switzerland. So 1,800 kilometers just to bring me some Swiss food, Swiss specialties, greet me, this kind of thing. And I have literally hundreds of requests of that. And that shows two things. First of all, that you still have people who understand what's going on, but also have a heart, which is also important. But it shows also that there is the disconnect between, because the idea of a sanction is to make you invisible, to discard you, to put you out of the society. And you see that is exactly the opposite that happens. I have countless requests for shows, for interviews and all that in alternative media and all that. So meaning that these sanctions do not even reach the objective they might have, that people understand that, and they understand more and more that our leadership, the establishment, generally speaking, is going beyond where it should. And that is, we're going beyond rationality. We are going beyond humanity. We are going beyond the values we tend to advocate. Now, Europe, I can say the European Union is in fact, and that's a fact, is doing exactly the same that we wanted to fight when we fought against the Warsaw Pact or Soviet Union 40 years ago. They do exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing that's happening now. You take decisions without regards to the law. And that's the kind of thing that should be a source of concern for everybody. And therefore, for all who resist to that, and when I said the word resistance, I have to say I come from, part of my family was in the French resistance during World War II. And sometimes when people come and bring me food, they say, well, they feel like resistant. Like during the World War II. It's exactly the same feeling. It's very interesting because this is something that is very unexpected, but that's exactly the feeling of some people. They are resistant. And to resist, remember that at the end of World War II, the resistant won. And they were the ones who were praised for their courage, for the determination, and for the rational approach to the problem. And so we are here in the same situation.
Yep. And I see it exactly like that. It's an act of resistance that's now needed. And the more resist, the higher the chances that it will succeed. So everybody watching, thank you very much for the support. Thank you very much for the collective thinking about this and for the collective resistance against what we all know and feel is very negative. Colonel Jacques Baud, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.